So you have an old hot rod, not this one, this one. And you've decided fuel injection's the way to go. Well, there's a lot of things to consider when you fuel inject an older car. And I'm going to cover a couple of those things here, some tips and tricks and some other issues, give you some ideas about some best practices that may work for you and even save you some money. Modern fuel-injected cars typically use a high-pressure feed line that will supply, anywhere between 40 to 60 psi fuel pressure to your injectors. This particular engine here is a multi-port fuel-injected engine where the fuel injectors are here right on top and it sprays them down in the port. Your most modern engines out there now are direct injected, gasoline direct injected, GDI, and those models will have injectors that go all the way down into the cylinder head, and sometimes they have both. That way they can spray a little fuel on top to try to help keep the valves clean and clear, and also spray directly into the engine. If you look at a modern day Corvette, as in a new version, 2018, 19, 2020, or a new Chevy Silverado, at least with your General Motors vehicles, you will see the LS series of engines, if you will, LT, LS, etc. And a lot of those now have direct injection as well. But what I'm showing you here will work for both direct and multi-port, depending on what kind of engine you're using on your hot rod. In order to get the fuel down here, we have to start out somewhere back around the tank, feeding the fuel to the engine. Most of your modern cars are going to have the fuel pump inside the fuel tank. That can get a bit tricky on an old hot rod, and it can also get quite a bit expensive. Many aftermarket fuel injection kits, and even injection kits to use an OE style engine and fuel injection system, can include external mounted fuel pumps. We're not going to talk about those here specifically. They can be noisy, and they can be a little bit less desirable than the inside OE tank as far as needing to be able to replace it in the event of a pinch if you have a breakdown. So we're going to talk about what we're doing here. When you're looking for a fuel tank or a fuel pump for your hot rod, you might expand your search a little bit, and instead of going straight to the catalogs that have the $1,000 plus custom made tanks with in-tank pump assemblies and sump systems and whatnot, look around the junkyard and see what is out there. You might be surprised what could be used on a modern day car. Now, modern is a relative term, all things considered. This is a 1969 Camaro. One of the features of these old Camaros is the fact that you could get to your fuel tank directly under your license plate. It's just a specific thing here. The 67, 68s had an opening up higher, and then your 69s had your opening down below. A lot of cars have this feature. When I was building this car, I did some looking around, and I found that the Caprice made, 94, 95, 96 Chevrolet Caprice Impala SS also put the fuel filler neck behind the license plate area. So a little bit of time looking, a little bit of grinding, a little bit of welding, a little bit of fabrication, and I was able to just barely squeeze this donor tank, which is somewhere over 20 gallons compared to the original tank that's in the teens. So it netted me a lot more range, and this is a composite tank that will never rust. There might be some nice options out there for you. Just be aware, if you're doing something like this, you have to consider all sorts of items like your suspension clearance. Had to do a little modification to the rear body panel, and I actually had to do a little massaging on the back of the Ford 9-inch in order to clear the tank with sufficient clearance back there. But I had the whole donor car, and that made life easier because I had the bracket, had everything else. If you consider doing a donor fuel tank for your hot rod, make sure you get everything possible from the donor vehicle. It will come in handy. Speaking of coming in handy, one of the problems with an in-tank fuel pump is when it fails, and it will fail, you have to drop the fuel tank out of the vehicle in order to replace it. And it's been my personal experience, and I guarantee some of you out there as well, that it never fails. Right after you filled the tank all the way up is when the pump goes out. So think creatively on this and think of other ways to do things. In this case, if you're building a hot rod to begin with and you're not worried about originality, take the opportunity to look for a way to put an access in the floor to reach your tank. What I did in this case is I borrowed the actual floor piece right here out of our Impala Caprice and made an access point to get to the tank. Now, here's the bad news. On this particular car, I just had a fuel pump failure. So we're going to go in here and change this and show you what the benefit is of having planned ahead and creating an area that I can get to the pump without dropping the tank. Because you are correct, I just filled the tank right before the pump quit. When you're using an in-tank fuel pump, what you want to do is try to find the tank and pump assembly for your replacement pump that's going to be compatible. So this is pretty typical right here. This is this design, the shape of a pump most commonly used in, well, goodness, lots of vehicles use these. This pump actually sits down inside the fuel tank and it bathes with fuel while it's running. Also, why, if your mama ever told you don't let your tank go less than a quarter of a tank, there's a good reason for that, because the lower the fuel goes in here, you're no longer keeping this submerged and it can run hotter. And electric pumps that run hot don't last as long. So what we're going to do in this case is replace the pump that's in the tank with this Aeromotive 11569. This is a General Motors style pump. Comes with a sock assembly. This also is an insulator that goes around. It helps cut down on noise for the pump as well. And a couple other tips and tricks you might consider. If you're building a fuel system for your old hot rod, you have a lot of choices. You can buy expensive lines that are made up of various fittings and pieces and parts that include braided lines and Aeroquip and others. They make these bits and pieces that go in there, and it gets really pricey. I've built fuel systems like that, and while they're nifty looking and while they're robust, they're also pricey and difficult to work with, especially if you have a breakdown or a problem on the road. So let me show you something. You can actually purchase raw style nylon fuel line like what's found on modern cars, and pretty much every car uses some version of this nylon style line. You can purchase that. Your modern cars use a quick disconnect fitting that will pop over the fuel line, and it uses a tool that you press in there to release the clips that are normally found. This one's just a test one to show you. Release the clips and you pull that off of your fuel line. When you're building your own custom fuel kits, you can go to companies like SUR&R. Dorman Products also makes them. This is a modern style fuel line connector, and simply what you do is you get your raw line, you cut your line to length, you slide this clip over it, you press that into the line, slide the clip back, and you use a side angle tool and you just crimp that down, and that puts your fuel line on. Now, some of them you just press in place and they don't require the tool. I find these to be very handy. You can get these in straights, 45s, male, female, all the different pieces you need. So plumbing a fuel system on an old hot rod suddenly becomes a lot easier, especially when you can just buy the straight line and put the fittings together on your own. Your modern fuel systems are going to require some sort of return line and a regulator system. This right here is a 5th generation Corvette fuel filter. The 5th generation Corvette fuel filter incorporates both a diaphragm for pressure, a filter, and a return. What's nice about these, when it's time to service your fuel filter, you also get a brand new regulator in there so that your fuel system is always running top notch. This particular unit is a Wix brand from Napa. These are recommended. Also, obviously, the AC Delco is a great brand, and they're pretty compact, can be mounted in a lot of locations. I gotta admit, this is probably the jinkiest thing on this whole car, is my fuel filter regulator sits down here slightly higher than the exhaust and other parts. But knock on something, to date, I haven't had a problem with this particular component. I could move it somewhere else, but this makes it super easy for servicing anytime I've needed to get to it or do anything with it. But your fuel system is going to have some kind of filter regulator, and you'll notice on this one, this other brand here, this one doesn't even need a tool. This is the type of quick connect fitting. I can actually just squeeze that and that will release. So that's 1,000 times better than those high dollar fittings and stuff you might otherwise use to build a system. Here's another completely top tip for you. If you're going to put a fuel injection system into an old car like this, and maybe even into a newer car that you're making modifications to, having a fuel pressure gauge is worth its weight in gold. Being that I just had a fuel pump failure in this car, it was super easy to diagnose why it quit running. One quick look at the gauge and we knew what was going on. So this particular gauge is an autometer, and what's nice about it is it uses a sending unit out on the fuel rail, so everything's contained out there as far as the sending unit, and then it's just wires that run back into the car. I've actually seen some of the fuel gauges out there that use like a fuel line going to them, or they're wet gauges mounted directly on the engine. If you like those for your purposes, that may be fine, but I like to keep the fuel away from the gauge and away from any glass or anything that could break or fail. And on this unit, much like a modern car, when I go to the start function, there it is. Powers right up and lets you know the status of your fuel pressure. Before we get too deep into this job, we definitely want to disconnect the battery. We don't want to have any power directly on the pump, and we certainly don't want to run a risk of a spark, especially since my battery is in the trunk on this particular model and it is in close proximity to the fuel tank. Next thing we're going to do is open up the cover. And there's your magic sauce. So now we have direct access to this fuel pump. One thing you'll notice here, this system runs a little differently than just a basic fuel injection system. The last time I put the pump in, the recommendation was to upsize to an 8-gauge wire. Normally your fuel pump wire is closer to this size, and this is the size we went with for the purpose of this installation. So I used some heavy connectors, and I have a relay mounted, and my power going to the relay is right here at the battery. With DC power, the shorter the run, the larger the cable, the more amperage you can flow more easily. So that's the idea behind this. So I will go ahead and get this all opened up, and we'll have access to the pump here shortly. All right, so we got all this open, and as I was pointing out previously, this is a factory 1996 Caprice tank and sending unit assembly. And I've also used the modern style lines. Requires a tool like this. That tool gets placed over the line. We're going to see a little fuel spray here because I do have some pressure in the system. But that tool goes on, and with a little bit of convincing, there it is. It's released. Now, on one hand, it's quite rewarding that that's all there is to it. And on the other hand, it might be a little frightening that that's all there is to it. Okay, so this is the return line. This little tool slides over, pops in, goes in place. Line can then be removed. Easy peasy. There's a little nipple that goes on that line, and that's what this thing catches on. So that's it. We're now disconnected. Now I also put a vapor system on this. One huge benefit of running an OE tank is you can run a charcoal canister in it, which is going to cut down on the stinky fuel vapors when the car's just sitting around. That's what this line is for here. This line goes over to a charcoal canister that I have mounted in the fender that actually came out of a, like a 2004 or 5 Silverado, Tahoe, something like that, but it's down in the quarter. All right, just finished this up by popping the rest of those bolts off. Now we have access to remove fuel pump assembly. You want to be careful with this because this is the sending unit that lets your gauge know how much fuel is in the vehicle, and it's a bit of a trick to figure out the exact position to remove it, but there it is. So we're going to take this over to the bench and finish the disassembly. But yeah, this is the one thing here you want to be super careful of to keep from breaking it. Just going to head over to the bench now. So taking a look at this, I do notice a problem. My replacement pump and my original pump have a different connector. So I'm going to have to address that before we get too far into here to go from this one to that one. So exactly why it's this way, I don't know, but that's the way this particular one came. And I'm going to go in here and begin the process of releasing this from the assembly. Got a hose clamp on it. And one of the neat things about these is they have this, this is this floating style pump in here that keeps it at the bottom of the tank no matter what goes on. So you get the maximum possible fuel pressure availability because it's always in the wet part of the sump. Okay, and all right, and removing this from here. I've got to release this clamp. Always easier said than done. Okay, there's my fuel lines out. This is going to pop off the bottom, our pickup portion of it. And open this lid up. So there is our pump. Now this is the original pump that I've had in here for a while. Interesting to note, it is also a stealth pump. My original one here was a 11140, and this replacement one is a 11569. All right, so there's our pumps. We'll go ahead and start the process of getting these changed. One thing that is interesting, I noticed this original pump here, the wire harness on the pump side is removable, and on this side it's permanent made in. That's kind of fascinating. All right, and we're going to need that. There we go. Okay, so that pump is out. A couple differences. This original pump is a center vent. This replacement one is a side pickup. They both have a screen in them to pick up any debris that doesn't get cleared by the filter. And there we go. Well, this is reality. I'm on hold here with Aeromotive. I just want to confirm. But it turns out that my replacement pump, wrong pump. I really needed to get a 11140, which apparently may or may not still be a continuous made pump. So I'm going to check with him to see what the upgrade to this pump is, and then we'll rejoin this video later when I have the correct pump. The good news is I can return this, it's undamaged, it's unused, and we can start over with the correct pump, one that matches this one. Okay, a little education for me. Just got off the phone with the tech line at Aeromotive. My old pump was an 11.5, wherever it is here, an 11.140. The modern replacement of that would be an 11.540. Now, the reality is all of their 340 pumps here are the exact same in terms of performance. It just makes a difference on how they mount in the car and what's going on. So this pump is actually compatible, which is the 11.569. But when I started looking at the harness, I noticed that we've got some issues with the harness. And it turns out this is the old style, the way they've been done for, a couple decades. This is actually not E85 compatible. E85 has a lot of, ethanol. It's hygroscopic and it can create moisture, corrosion, other things with the ethanol. And so what they did is they totally sealed this down inside of this portion of it. So the fix is that I can either order a kit from them, a wire kit that's a 16701, and actually, as I look at it, it is probably not the best fit for my application because I have to terminate into this plug that goes up inside the tank, up inside this plug here. So we're going to go ahead and perform a solder heat shrink connection, stagger these, make sure everything looks good in here. We obviously don't want to have a short in the tank. So I'll go ahead and get that set up, but apparently there's nothing to send back. Even though my ports are different in the location, it doesn't matter as long as that hole right there is not obstructed. And I am noticing a couple things, that porthole on the new one is larger than the old one. So it certainly are some design changes, but I'll go ahead and start the process of getting this one installed. And that's hot rodding. I don't care what you do, what you buy, what you put in. There's no such thing as bolt in. And every time you turn around, you're going to find something that needs to be modified. So good thing I didn't set a particular time limit today. This is going to certainly add to that process, but I'll be able to get this changed and get it in here shortly. So you know how they do those videos where they go 2 hours later? That'd be a good place to put that in on this video. No such thing as bolt-in. So here's the finished product before it gets installed. Go over a couple things with you. Again, I was able to use the 11.569 pump as opposed to what would have been a more direct fit to what was in there before was a 11540. However, per Aeromotive, all of these pumps work exactly the same. It just depends on application. And there was ample room to be able to mount this one in. And in fact, where the sock sits, this is more commensurate to the original stock pump that was in the 1996 Impala tank. The biggest difference on this is that the input wires here are sealed. On the original pump, this was more like the original 1996 and all the old pumps from General Motors back in the day had this plug. And that went in, and of course this end then went into the bulkhead in the top of the assembly. And these little tiny wires here would make contact in this bulkhead in order to drive the signal through the wiring. So I couldn't use those with this. I didn't want to cut and try to solder in. That would have been, you know, silly to add that many additional splices. So what I did do is use some gold terminal leads like this, crimped and soldered those to my secondary harness that comes with this pump. I then placed them onto the bulkhead connector, the male end, and I soldered those in there, slid the heat shrink down, and I did a double layer of heat shrink. This right here is the factory connector that went in and separated everything, and I left the center section in it so these two wires can't contact. So it actually has better contact now than it did originally because this is soldered solid in here. You do have to pull a ground off. The ground goes to the sending unit for the fuel card. If you're doing any of these, pay attention to what's going on before you reassemble, because it's easy to pop the float out of the fuel card slot, which don't ask me how I know, because I know. So that right there, once it's popped in and it's functioning, this is the signal that reads for the fuel gauge. It has to have a ground to it to create the reference. That ground is tied to the same ground, and this is factory, as the ground that runs the pump. And what I did here is I went ahead and I had to cut the side of the plug off to fit through this hole. Again, nothing like hot rodding, right? But that's now in, this is tight, that's tight, everything's assembled. And let me share another quick trick with you. This adhesive. Handy thing to have around the shop, because your O-ring seal that goes in the top, whenever you're trying to put one of these in, you're always fighting with it and the ring is falling down and everything's going crazy. So the easy way to solve that is to put a little bit of adhesive on your O-ring and go ahead and glue it in place so that you're not playing wiggle around with it to get it in. So there's the assembly there, and the install is, you know, reverse of the removal. So this is going to go fished in. It's going to get set in place. My O-ring's in there to seal back to the tank, and then we'll reconnect these lines. I can actually go ahead and pop these off. If you remember, these were the handy tools right here to get it separated. All right, so let's go ahead and put it back in the car. All right, gonna go ahead and drop it back in. It's a little bit of a puzzle to go in. We're gonna start out by dropping the fuel float in and then twisting in the sock. All right, looks good. Now there's slots up here to orient the receiver, the neck, everything in the right spot. And there it is, all lined up. All right, now I just need to finish reconnecting the lines. I didn't build a lot of slack into this part of it when I put it together. So it takes a little effort to get it put in, but there it is. That's the snap you want to hear. Looks good. Going to bring up this little vapor line. Connect it. Okay, pretty straightforward. This line doesn't use a clamp, it just goes in place. This right here is the fuel sending unit. All right. That completes that part. Then of course we have the wire harness. And what I did with this is I made sure that you couldn't mix them up when I put these together. Any of you that mess with solar power may notice these M4 connectors, and I use these on my solar equipment that I have. Really handy, heavy duty, can handle a lot of amps and volts. That takes care of that connection and that connection. Now what we'll do is go ahead and I will connect the battery and we'll do a test to make sure that it's not leaking. The concern for leak could be here or here. And see that the pump comes online and then button it all back up. All right. I'm gonna check for leaks. Listen carefully. Should hear the pump come on. All right, any leaks? It's dry. It's dry. Okay, here goes the moment of truth. That needle will stay up like that where it last has the memory when you turn it off. So we're going to go to power up. I hear the pump. Let's see if it'll start. Beautiful. That's what we want. All right, get the carpet back in place and we'll go take it for a ride.